I'd like to invite you to pray with me, please. God, we ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations in all of our hearts might be acceptable in your sight, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Dr. Artika Tyner, who's a civil rights attorney, a law professor, and an author. She's on a mission to get kids reading. And more, as a person of color and a person fueled by her Christian faith in her efforts in this world, Dr. Tyner is on a mission to get children's books into children's hands with characters who represent the racial and ethnic diversity of all humanity, so that children will be more likely to see themselves in these stories and further increase the chances that they'll develop a love for reading that positively fuels their lives. As Dr. Tyner says, reading a book opens up your outlook on life, opens up your perspective. I would add that for many of us, books help us see the possibilities of a world beyond the one which we currently know. We should never doubt the power of one person to make a difference, including Dr. Tyner and her work to make sure that all people, starting with our children, are seen and come to see themselves with the dignity and possibilities that they deserve. We should never doubt the power of one person to make a difference, like the courageous librarians and parents and everyday citizens who in recent years have been pushing back on efforts to censor and erase stories of diversity from our schools and public libraries, especially stories that represent LGBTQ persons and their families. Many of us might have thought the days of book burning and book banning were over, something we'd only read about in a book. Yet the work to end prejudice and build up love is not a one and done endeavor, but the great long work of humanity in our struggle to raise ourselves beyond animalistic instincts of survival and becoming thinking and aware beings who make choices that reflect ideals of love, compassion, justice, respect, and courage. For it takes courage, does it not? And hard work to break down false binaries. That is to say, the incorrect belief that things that make us different from our neighbors make those neighbors and other, all too often to be feared or denigrated. It takes courage and work to break down false binaries and build up the practice of love in ourselves, in this world. The writer of the book of James in our lesson today tells us to beware of the things, to beware of the ways and the things we may judge in our minds and hearts and actions. Do you say you love your neighbor? Are you striving to be a good person, especially a person of faith, and then treat the people who dress nicely and smell good differently from people who might look like they're in need of a shower? Do you wish everyone well, including those who needed food and shelter, but then do nothing that actually helps other people to be well? The writer of James says that faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. And what is this faith of which the writer of James speaks? Maybe faith looks like our gospel story today. Maybe faith looks like a mother so convinced of the power of God at work in this Jesus that she's been hearing about, that she crosses the known Gentile Jewish ethnic boundaries and male-female gender intersection boundaries of her time. We're talking some 2,000 years ago. These were very different times. In order to beseech Jesus to heal her sick daughter. Boy, talk about courage. Something in this parent knew, just knew deep down that Jesus could help her. She stood firm in the face of Jesus' initial denial and repeats her request in another way. And then healing is granted. So the Syrophoenician woman's faith leads to her daughter's healing, as well as to making clear that the power and promise of God's healing and love was available not only for the Jewish people, but for all people. This story of healing and breaking down perceived human boundaries expanded the library, if you will. Expanded the library of available for stories for people trying to understand faith and love and the possibility of finding healing for themselves and the ones they love. This is in keeping with God as God is described in Psalm 146. And I quote, "The Lord sets the prisoner free. The Lord opens the eyes of the blind. The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord watches over the strangers. God upholds the orphan and the widow." We humans, in our sometimes brokenness, sinfulness, we build differences between us and others like walls within our minds and hearts and along our borders. This is so different than the story of God, as we hear, who, as we heard all the way back in the book of Genesis, created all of humanity and all of our diversity and saw that it was good. And this is so different than God's intention for prisoners to be freed, the sick healed, the orphan and the widow cared for. Fortunately, God has not stopped God's creating work and has added into the mix of this created world and us as created people the redeeming love of Christ that seeks to work over all the places where we as humans will fall short of the grace and love and faith of God being planted in this world and even in us. Yes, faith is something planted in us. Something we know even if we don't necessarily understand it. And faith is something that, as we become aware of it, thrusts us into action that may change not only us, but those whom we love and the world around us. Research has shown that dolphins and whales and myriads of other animals care for the sick among them, adopt the orphaned young. So perhaps there's hope for us human animals as well. Certainly reading stories of people like Dr. Tyner and her efforts for diverse and comprehensive literacy gives me hope. So too do the courageous librarians and other people resisting censorship. And our own unfolding story through this community that gathers not just on Sunday, but labors together in different ways through the week, through Redeemer Lutheran here in New Paltz, seeking to be faith active in love for the world in a myriad of ways. This gives me hope as well. For in all of these people and stories, and so many more people whose stories we may never know, there is reflected what the Christian faith understands to be the love and grace of God. It is love and faith that calls us to compassionate, evolving, and growing care and love for all imaginable people, for every neighbor, no exceptions. And it is faith that calls us to action. I invite us to take a moment or two Maybe another breath or two, maybe roll those shoulders back again. For like me, I'm always noticing how I'm tensing up accidentally in one place or another. We can breathe in at the peace and grace of God. Help us to ponder how these readings, the hymns, the prayers, and maybe this reflection are prodding us to think about our lives, to think about how we too might be active in love, in faith, helping those in need, helping to build a world that reflects love, grace, mercy, justice.